Talk about the numbers, since that's the most recent news. What do you think? How is the economy doing right now?
Look, I think the economy on its own is continuing to grow, though not at the rate it was growing. It's slowing down globally. It's slowing down in the United States. I actually think the real risk to the economy right now is self-inflicted. The chaos in trade policy, the chaos in geopolitical tension has created real fears. You're seeing that show up in a lot of leading indicators. You're seeing it in business confidence. You're seeing it in investment levels. And now you're starting to see it in consumer confidence indices. And yes, the economy is collective psychology. If people start to be worried, it affects behavior. I think that a lot of these problems are generated by a misguided sense of how you project strength in the world. And we're going to need to figure out how to get out of this without creating an economic problem that is bigger than it needs to be.
Well, let's just talk about the idea that business confidence, or at least spending, corporate spending out front, capital expenditures, has not been what had been anticipated. If we see a trade deal that gets completed with China, maybe not this weekend, but over the coming weeks and months, do you think that that clears the way and that businesses will then say, okay, I'm ready to spend and I know what the rules of the road are?
Well, first of all, coming out of the tax cut, you didn't see a big boost in business investment. You really didn't. There's no indication that it's led to the kind of boom in investment that was supposed to come from it. That was kind of before the trade wars. You now have this threat of an ongoing, rolling set of trade tensions. My own view is that there will be a path towards some kind of a ceasefire with China. It's in nobody's interest to have this boil over and become full-blown trade war, full-blown conflict. It's by no means certain. There's lots of things that could come off the rails between now and some kind of modest agreement. But we're not done with the trade tension. There's going to be a decision on autos for Europe and Japan. What we just saw a few weeks ago with Mexico, it's a kind of chaotic using of trade policy to accomplish almost any end. And it's made business very nervous.
Mr. Secretary, so Barry Knapp is one of our guests. He says there was a revision, and the numbers just came out for intellectual property investment, up 12%, revised up from 7.2%. He says, clear indication of a software boom from tax reform and business investment.
So I haven't seen that number. You might find one pinpoint where you can see some impact, but you look across the manufacturing economy, you look across the broad U.S. economy, we haven't seen it. There's study after study that shows that the tax cut has gone to buybacks and dividends. And now you can argue that that reflows into the economy, but that wasn't the argument for this kind of tax reform. I think what we've seen, is policies that have deepened the core problems we have. The biggest threat we have is an internal one, the combination of income inequality and a sense that the government doesn't work for all the people. We haven't fixed that. We've made that worse. And now the challenge is going to be to fix it with no money in the bank.
Of the candidates that you saw last night in the debate and the ones that will be in the debate tonight, is there anybody you think is interesting?
Look, I think there are a lot of interesting candidates. I think one of the things that was quite remarkable is they actually talked policy last night. You could listen and hear what they thought. They didn't all agree. They did agree on a lot of the problems. They had different approaches to how to
The private sector is a problem. Is that, you're a Treasury Secretary. You don't sit there and chafe when you hear that?
Look, it's not. You know me well enough to know it's not the way I talk. But I've
do you feel that?
I've listened to your show enough to hear people I know well, like Ray Dalio and Larry Fink and other people like Marty Lipton, who raise the same concerns. These are not small issues.
Do you think, is this statement false, that most prosperity comes from the private sector? No prosperity comes from the government, right? I mean, they don't generate any prosperity.
Joe, I believe that we need a free market economy that works.
Oh, I'm sure. You're a Treasury Secretary. Of course you do.
We also need to have a combination of policies and business practices that support the social compact, which is the underpinning of a free market economy. That's starting to crumble. So we're going to need to solve these problems. And frankly, I think if we don't see business practices start to change, you're going to see an overreaction in government.
Do you think it's already here? When they asked a question last night that, do you want to see the private insurance sector done away with? And two of the candidates, including the one who was leading the polls on that stage last night, raised their hands.
But Becky, I would focus on the other side. 8 didn't.
They just get rid of private insurance.
For insurance, for healthcare, yes.
8 did not raise their hand.
8 did not.
I think the idea that we go all the way to doing away with private insurance is not a good one. Do we need to make sure that there's health care for all? Yes. Do we need to have a public option? Yes. There are middle grounds that are consistent with fixing our system as opposed to blowing it up. Political
Do you get-
dysfunction has
do you
made it very hard to
do you
get those
concerned
solutions.
by the extremes on both sides?
No,
that
I think a debate is good when there's very different positions.
No, don't say let's have the discussion.
The question is where the solution comes. This is the beginning of the process, not the end of the process. I'm hopeful and I'm relatively confident that
we should
will
entertain the wackiest of the wacky ideas. You think we should have those discussions?
Joe, I've heard some pretty wacky ideas on the other side that unfortunately become mainstream.
Like what?
Look, I think some of the tax theories that tax cuts pay for themselves are proven wrong by every economist, yet I hear another side believing it. I don't actually think Democrats have adopted the kinds of policies that don't work.
Do you think MMT, do you think this modern
policies.
monetary thing works, Jack? I mean, do you think...
Look, I'm not a fan of modern monetary theory, but I got to tell you, after a kind of tax cut that showed that one side doesn't care how much it adds to the debt, there's a desire now.
You forgot about the $10 trillion that Obama added.
You're forgetting that we reduced the deficit from 10 to 3% of GDP.
Yeah.
So we actually
started out at the financial crisis
if
at 10%.
anything, the fact that we were fiscally responsible is now being used as a criticism.
Fiscally responsible?
Why didn't we spend as if there was no limit? Now, I continue to believe...
Double the total debt from 10 to 20, that's fiscal responsibility?
Well,
I understand that's why we were at 10%.
I think it's much more interesting to talk about the future than the past, because you and I have had this debate.
Right,
I think when we ended the Obama administration, we had a higher level of private investment than we have today. The economy was on a good path. We are now in a place where there's this violent debate within the parties and between the parties about whether the system works. That's a big deal. And as somebody who was Treasury Secretary, I care deeply about protecting the system that works. But we have to fix the things that are broken to protect it.
So let's get back to G20 this weekend. You do think that a deal is eventually carved out. What do you anticipate that we'll hear? Because it's pretty high stakes right now.
Yeah, it is very high stakes. I think the highly confrontational approach is not one that ultimately is a productive one. There's an old saying that nothing's agreed to until everything's agreed to in a negotiation. You have to stay at it. You have to go with steps forward, steps back. This business of the huge threats and making it almost a humiliation to have agreements, I think, is a bad negotiating tactic. I think that it's not very likely that China will change its system in response to any U.S. demands, but it is likely that China will change things that are a source of real problems. We got China to change its exchange rate policy. You can get China to make progress on intellectual property, on opening markets. We ought to be focusing on making progress and doing it in a way that avoids making total conflict, inevitable.
How would you handle Huawei?
Look, I think Huawei has been handled in a really confusing way and a very bad way in terms of the integrity of the U.S. position. I don't know enough about the technology to know if it is a serious national security threat. I'm actually open to the idea that it is because it's risky. Can you mitigate it? That's a question you should be asking. What I do know is that if you extradite somebody or if you take sanctions, a Commerce Department action saying it's a national security threat, you've undermined your credibility if you then trade it away for something in a separate commercial trade negotiation.
But she has now put that on the table.
You need to be clear about what your policies are. The United States has been the leader of the world by standing for principles and by having integrity. If we say something is a national security issue and we say to our European allies, if you use it, we might cut you off from intelligence sharing, and then we say for something that's important to us in a trade negotiation, we'll say never mind, that undermines the United States as much as anything that China could do to us.